work. So that's kind of what we're focused on. And what we have right here is a picture of St. Basil's Basilica. St. Basil is the person who brings Eastern Orthodox Christianity into Russia and Eastern Europe, and that's still the main religion or the primary religion practiced in that region of the world. So that's what it's named for. And we also see some characteristics that are really important for us to identify. First of all, we see Byzantine influence in St. Basil's Basilica. It gives the feeling of the Hagia Sophia, which was the famous cathedral located in Constantinople. And it's just an iconic image of ancient Russia, and still to this day is a major tourist destination. Now, again, what we've said is that our main focus is to trace the development of the early Russian state, but we can't really talk about that. We can't really talk about Russia without really putting it into context and understanding why Russia is such an important state in the world today. In particular, Russia is a massive country, and just in for our own practical reasons here in the United States, it's important to understand the history of Russia and the modern situation or the current situation, the political situation, and the uneasiness between the United States and the modern Russian state. So that's kind of what we're going to discuss here a little bit too as we go through this. Now, we don't want to just come out and say that Russia is the bad guys. Now, that was definitely the case in the 20th century, from the 1950s really up until the late 1980s. But we do want to say that Russia is potentially the bad guys. They're very close to the United States. The eastern tip over here of Russia would almost border Alaska, just several miles apart. And strategically, Alaska was added to the United States for that reason, so that we could have a military presence there next to Russia. Also, historically speaking, in the 20th century, we experienced the Cold War, where the United States and Russia both possessed nuclear weapons, entered into an arms race to see who could basically create the most weapons, the most nuclear weapons, and it looked like that we might blow each other up and totally destroy the nation or the earth for national competition. So all this stuff is really important to understand. And most recently, Russia has invaded Ukraine, which is a topic of controversy. I think the majority of Americans have already said that they don't agree with this invasion of Ukraine, but nevertheless, I'm going to take an unbiased approach here and not really I'm not going to come out and say that, hey, I'm not going to condemn that action. But it is something that we have to keep our eye on. It's really the first time that a major world power has invaded a country, and probably since the late 1980s that I can remember, other than us. You know, we invaded Iraq in the early 2000s, but before that it would have been Russia invading Afghanistan in the late 1980s. So it's a major event in the world right now, and it's something that we have to pay attention to. And just, yeah, we kind of want to understand that Russia is a world power and potentially dangerous world power. So, credentials. Russia is the largest country in the world. Russia defeated Napoleon. Russia defeated the Germans in World War II. And Russia was the greatest rival of power with the United States. We've already mentioned that. Recently, Russia has attempted to regain status as a major world power. All of this stuff is important to understanding what we're doing here and understanding the history of Russia. Now, the history of Russia is connected, the early history of Russia is connected with the current Russian state and situation. And this is not Coach Davis speaking, this is just historical information and something that we want to talk about here as we go forward. Now, Vladimir Putin is currently the president of Russia, and this is a meme here making fun of the fact that Vladimir Putin has been in charge of Russia seemingly forever. Here he is riding a Triceratops. So, jokes aside, he has been the leader of Russia for over 20 years now and has been an important player in Russian politics for really half a decade or half a century, 50 plus years. And we're going to kind of talk about Vladimir Putin and how he's connected to these early Russian leaders as we go throughout this unit. Now, enough about modern Russia and the current political situation, all that. Let's talk about early Russia. It began to develop as a state around 8500 during the beginning of the Middle Ages, also called the Dark Ages. We're going to get into the reason why it's a misnomer here as we learn about the Middle Ages in the next few weeks. But we want to identify the time period 500 AD to 1300 AD. And if we don't know a lot about the Middle Ages, that's okay. We're going to learn about that, like I said before, throughout the next several weeks. Now, there are several major players, and we're going to talk about two of these, the Slavs and the Vikings first. The Slavs are an ethnic group of Central and Eastern European peoples who speak common language known as Slavic languages, and generally kind of organize around similar cultural and religious ideas. For example, they all practice Eastern Orthodox Christianity. There are several groups of Slavic people who have all developed their own individual countries. In fact, we can take a look at that here. Well, I said that. There we go. These are the Slavic nations of the world here, okay? The ones that are in beige would not be Slavic countries. So Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and many of the Balkan states are going to be considered Slavic nations. So that's the first group we're going to identify. Now, the Slavic people are going to inhabit those regions that we just looked at first. They're going to be people that live there, settle there, and live in little bitty tribal communities before the Russian state is ever created. Now, a group of people called the Vikings enter what is modern-day Ukraine, and they enter our story by traveling into this region of the world from this region of the world, from modern-day Scandinavia. So this is Scandinavia here, Denmark included, and the people that live there are famous for their warrior prowess and for trading and sailing across the whole world. In particular, they're going to travel across the Baltic Sea into Northern Europe and then use the Dnieper River to sail down south into what is modern-day Ukraine and eventually settle that area, intermixing with the Slavic people who live there and creating a new state. Okay, and that's what we're going to talk about. So these Scandinavian people that we call the Vikings were explorers, traders, and warriors who raided, explored, traded, and colonized many places in the world. And our third group is the Mongols, an ethnic group of Central Asian people who live on the Eurasian steppe, and in particular the Mongolian plateau, who shared a nomadic tradition and a common language, along with many other cultural concepts such as their religion. Now, I want you guys to go into the study folder in Schoology and watch the video of the Mongols that I put in there about the Mongols. If you haven't already, it's a pretty good video. It's TED Ed, and it shows how the Mongols come into power and eventually become the largest land empire in the history of the world. The Mongols are going to be important to our story as well. So just kind of identifying some players here as we go forward. The Vikings, famous for their longboats that were used to sail across oceans and even into creeks as well. So that's kind of the technological innovation of the Vikings. They're able to create this boat that can travel long distances in the open water, and then they can also sail in very shallow waters. It was used to enter territories and sneak into people's villages and attack them before they really ever knew that they were under attack. We know a lot about, or what we know about the Rus Vikings, the group of Vikings that's going to settle into Kiev and Rus, is from an account of a Muslim merchant trader who wrote down his experiences or his encounter with Vikings that were supposedly Rus Vikings in his country. And this is the description that he gives us. Tall, blonde-headed, and tattooed. And this is pretty much an image created exactly as Ibn Fadlan described. Here's actually his account right here that you guys have gone into and read about in your bell ringer. Now, here's a depiction of culturally and ethically what the Slavic people are stereotyped as. And we're going to move on here, and we're going to talk about how these players all matter to our story of the development of Russia. Kievan Rus is the first state established that's going to be made up of Rus Vikings and Slavic people, these people that intermix. It happens in 900 AD. Now notice the word Rus here, right? Well, obviously these Rus Vikings and these Slavic people are going to create the next state, or the modern state of Russia. Eventually it's going to become that. Now, I don't really know if we really classify Kievan Rus as the first Russian state. It's really more complicated than that. Eventually the first Russian state, I guess, is going to be Muscovy, but Russia does begin here in Kievan Rus. The culture and politics are influenced by the Byzantines, the Romans, the Eastern Romans to the south, and they have a very powerful economy based on merchant trade. And here is Kievan Rus, which is pretty much modern-day Ukraine, Belarus, and Eastern Russia. So this area right here would be the state of Kievan Rus. And we have another image of Kievan Rus that traces these trade routes that are going to make it a powerful place. Obviously, trade along the Dnieper River, the Vistula River, and the Volga River is going to all center around this state of Kievan Rus, making the Slavic and Viking people, or Rus people, very powerful and wealthy. So everything's rocking and rolling here in the state of Kievan Rus. Like we said, eventually Kievan Rus is Christianized and becomes Eastern Orthodox Christian, not Roman Catholic Christian. We've already talked in this class about the Great Schism, the separation between the Catholic Church and then this Eastern Church. And many of the style of the Kievan Rus leaders, they're going to stylize themselves after their Roman neighbors to the south. As we can see, Constantinople, the capital of Rome, really just a few hundred miles away from the capital city of Kiev, and that is going to be the style. And we see the Roman architecture here, or the influence of Roman architecture on this very famous structure located in Kiev, Ukraine today. And notice our heading, our title, Russia starts in Kiev. So that's where the controversial issue comes into today with, with Russia and Ukraine's relations. And we're really not going to get really deep into the Russia-Ukrainian conflict currently right now. But I do want you to understand that that is kind of, this history here does shape that modern day conflict. Now, the rise of the Mongols. The Mongols, we're not going to, actually, I'll tell you what, we're not going to talk about this. Go watch that video that we talked about. The biggest thing I want you to understand is that's not in the video is that the Mongols do have a technological advantage in their combat, which is that every member of their military is on horseback, and it contributes, that technological advantage allows them to defeat their opponents and eventually create this empire, right? This massive empire that begins the Mongolian plateau that eventually extends almost over all of Asia and great parts of even Eastern Europe. Now, here's where the Mongols matter to us. So we have the Kievan Rus, this first state, or the Slavic and Rus state established in 900 AD, is invaded and conquered by the Mongols in 1240 AD. Now, one of the things that the Mongols do that is genius is they allow their local people to stay in charge, or local people that have been conquered to maintain their power. In particular, Alexander Nevsky is the guy that they allowed to rule over the city of Novgorod, located in the northern portion of Kievan Rus. And Alexander Nevsky's bloodline eventually gains power and become the first czars of Russia. And we're going to describe how that happens here as we go forward throughout this lesson. We got lots of pictures there of the Mongol invasion. So the Mongols conquer, they rule over Russia for a very long time, but in exchange, really all they ask that the Russians do after they conquer them is that they pay tribute to the Mongols. They basically pay them taxes periodically, and they also get to choose their favorite Russian ruler to rule over Russia. Now, that Russian ruler is going to be able to make the rules, the laws, and rule over Russia in the same way that he would if the Mongols weren't there. And this guy that they've chosen to begin with is Alexander Nevsky. Now, he's able to do this because he helps the Mongols defend off their territory, right, this Russian territory. So he defends Novgorod from an invasion of German people and Swedish people, which would be those Vikings that we talked about, right, or at least the descendants of those Vikings. By this time, they're Swedes. They're different. They're Christianized. But either way, those group of people, they invade Russia. And Nevsky defends the territory, and the Mongols give him the power to rule over and even tax the people of Russia on behalf of the Mongols. Now, here's the reason why Nevsky is able to gain power and wealth, even though he's really serving the Mongols. Because whatever he charges the people of Russia, or whatever the Mongols are asking for tribute, Nevsky's going to charge more, and he's going to take what's ever left over that's not given to the Mongols for his own family's sake. So he's going to skim off the top, right? This allows Nevsky to become very rich. Eventually, his family is going to rule over Moscow, or descendants are going to rule over Moscow. Something else that's occurring during this time is people who are seeking to get away, or sought to get away from the Mongol invasion of Kievan Rus, have moved northeast to Muscovy, which is not a part of the Kievan Rus at this time in history. Muscovy is the modern-day city, or is located in the modern-day city of Moscow, or at least the capital of Muscovy is going to be the modern-day city of Moscow. So, Moscow becomes very populated, excuse me. It becomes economically prosperous because it sits at a trade route in between Europe and Asia. And we're going to look at a map here that will better explain this. And we just see kind of all of the wealth and pretty much all of the culture, everything move from Kievan Rus and Kiev into this new state of Muscovy. Now, somewhere after Alexander Nevsky, Ivan III is his family. Now this Nevsky family has gained so much power and wealth that Ivan III has the capability to live like a Roman emperor, and he begins to do so. He begins to build palaces, cathedrals, and fortresses in Muscovy, and he even begins calling himself Caesar, which is translated into Tsar in Russian. So he's stylizing himself after the Roman emperors that we've seen and we've already studied in Eastern Rome, and then even before that in Western Rome. And he's named Ivan the Great. He does a lot of things. He makes Muscovy a more powerful and stronger place, conquering territory for Russia and for the Mongols, because he's still under the control of Mongol rule. His son, Ivan IV, also known as Ivan the Terrible, begins as an energetic, charismatic, and we would even say, might even say liberal ruler for his time. It makes great gains on behalf of his country and on behalf of the Russians. He ends Mongol rule at 1480 AD, and he really becomes our first Tsar of Russia, the first leader of this new Russian state. And he expands the territory of Muscovy, and he creates the first Russian empire, ruled by only a Russian person. And he sets, I guess, the blueprint for all of the later czars that are going to follow, and he establishes a trend that we're going to see throughout history, and that, or Russian history, and that is that the Russians are going to have an autocratic ruler, a ruler who has total power over his country, and someone who is going to use whatever means necessary to stay in power and to rule their country, especially with the use of force. Ivan IV begins his first half of his life as ruler in a very, the word I'm looking for here is maybe a free way, a tolerant way. And then towards the second half of his rule, he starts to commit major atrocities, killing the boyar class, which were the descendants of those Rus Vikings that we've talked about, the nobles who rivaled his power or could potentially challenge his power, basically committed genocide of them to solidify his control, famously torturing many of his inhabitants, and even killing his son in a fit of rage after he and his son got in a conflict, hitting him over the head with a scepter, and then immediately weeping his fallen son. Some think that Ivan IV may have been deranged mentally, may have had disabilities, or even suffered from like bipolar syndrome. These are all topics up for debate and study of modern day historians. But either way, one thing is for certain, and this Ivan IV established a trend in Russian history, and that's what we want to identify. And we're going to kind of trace this here in a second. So here is the Ivan IV's Russian state. And then, as we see, it extends eastward. And then eventually by Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, Russia is going to be a very large country, an empire. So the rise of the czars. This is the trend that we want to see. The rise of the czars begins tradition in Russia, as they would, in Russia, would favor autonomous rulers who claimed to be defenders of Roman and Greek culture. And this is important. It's an important characteristic or important feature that I forgot to mention. And that is that Ivan IV is going to justify his invasion of some of these territories. And the later czars of Russia are going to justify their invasion of other territories and their establishment of empire, because they are defending and spreading Roman and Greek culture and Eastern Orthodox Christianity, or they're defending the Slavic nations of the world. Also, we see the effect that the Mongol invasion had on Russia. It causes Eastern Europe to develop separately from the rest of Western Europe, separating the Slavic people, and we see the effects of that still today, as we have all these different Slavic territories, separation of countries like Ukraine, Belarus, and Croatia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Serbia. All of these have these modern states have their roots in this history that we're discussing now. And that the system of government that's established by Ivan IV and Ivan III, where you have a czar, a Caesar, an emperor, or king, whatever you want to call it, in control over Russia in 1462, that lasts until 1917, when we have the Bolshevik Revolution, or the Communist Revolution in Russia, where the regular people, right, the Slavic people of Russia, overthrow their royal government and establish a communist government, which doesn't really last very long, or at least not in the way that their hero idealized it, Lenin, right? Instead, what they also have is an autocratic leader with Joseph Stalin. So we're going to discuss all this. Ivan III, the first of these, right? The first Tsar of Russia, like we said, he's the one that lives like an emperor. There's a picture of him. And then there's Ivan IV, the first Tsar of Russia that emerges in, like we said, 1480 AD, and really establishes the modern Russian state in this trend that we've discussed. Peter the Great, several czars of Russia rule between it, but we're just kind of looking at the great men or the great leaders here, and women included, of Russia. 1696 to 1725, Peter the Great, famous for expanding Russian territory and also liberalizing Russia a little bit, behaving more like a Western ruler than an Eastern ruler. And then he is succeeded by Catherine the Great. Catherine the Great continues to rule in the same way that Peter does, westernizing and reaching out to Western countries and allowing for a much more open Russia than previous rulers, such as Ivan IV. But we see the return almost every time of that autocratic leadership that we've described. And it looks like in 1917, with the Communist Revolution, that there may be this time period where the regular people of Russia are going to rule their country. And even though for us here in the West, we look at communism, we've been afraid of it for over 100 years, and we look at it with distrust, rightfully so. There's still kind of a victory for the Russian people, this 1917 revolution, similar to the American Revolution. But, like we said, just a few years after the revolution was successful, Joseph Stalin emerges as an autocratic leader, commits genocide in very similar ways as Ivan IV, or as his neighbors to the west, the Germans, with Hitler. And today we're just still discovering mass graves of genocide, these atrocities committed by Joseph Stalin. And the story goes on, right? In the 1990s, we see the fall of the Berlin Wall. It looks like that Russia may truly be a democracy. And it looks like that they may be friends of the West and friends of the United States, and that we can leave all this nuclear scare, this fear of total destruction behind us, and then enter Vladimir Putin, who is supposedly a president of the United States, but in reality it seems to be, of course, this is controversial statement, so take what I'm saying with a grain of salt, but it appears to be that Vladimir Putin is an autocratic ruler, right? And ruling in the same way that these other people have in the past. And so all of these things, what we're seeing here is a trend going all the way forward to where we're at now in history, which is that autocratic rule. Now, is it fair for me to call Vladimir Putin an autocratic ruler? Well, he's ruled since pretty much the mid-90s, where he's had a major part in the rule of Russia since the mid-90s, and he's pretty much been president for over 20 years. I don't know if that's a fair statement or not. I'm going to leave that for you guys to decide, because I do believe in that. I want you to establish your own opinions on all of these world events, okay? But it does appear that he is, at least in my judgment, an autocratic ruler, ruling in the same way or adopting the trend of the ancient czars of Russia. And he's even made comments appealing or talking about the greatness of former czars and trying to reclaiming the tradition of Russia, which is what many analysts believe that he's trying to do with his invasion of Ukraine, which is reclaim what Russia used to be, the Russian Empire. Okay, so all of these should be understood really well to understand the present, right? Understand these current events that are happening in our world today. History is useful, right? We see the history of Russia, the roots of Russia. All of this is useful for understanding the present. And that's the importance of the lesson today. Now, the immediate importance for you is for you to make a good grade on your tests. And in order to do that, you have a study guide. You've got several videos, including this one, that you can study to help prepare you for that.